So thank you very much, Richard, and it's a very great pleasure to be able to take part in this conference in honour of Adrienne. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to talk about the relationship between monetary union and economic integration. And my perspective is that of a lawyer who's interested in economics. So there'll be some law and some economics in this presentation, but no political science as far as I can tell. So sorry about that, but maybe we can discuss how this might play to a political science agenda. Let's begin by thinking about what actually caused the Eurozone crisis and then how the legal system responded to it. I would suggest that there are short-term causes which are really exogenous to the EU. Shock caused by a financial crisis which did not originate in mainland Europe. That did, however, cause public sector deficits in mainland Europe, falling tax revenues, rising social security spending, and then government bailouts of private sector financial institutions. We begin with private debt, and it then becomes sovereign debt. That's what happened. And there were some serious policy mistakes from 2010 onwards. As the EU responded uneasily to this crisis, the ECB was too slow in responding to the debt crisis. It was too late, almost, when Mario Draghi said, we'll do whatever it takes to save the euro. And there was a skewed focus, I would suggest, on social policy in the memoranda of understanding agreed between the Troika and the debtor states. So social policy was not the cause of the crisis. So, typical policy, we address the wrong causes, at least to begin with. But longer term, there are more serious problems, I think, in the design of the EU itself and the design of the single currency. And that's what I want to discuss. Legal and institutional asymmetry between a single monetary policy, but a non-unified economic policy, and a non-unified social policy was built into the post-Maastricht institutional settlement. And the consequences of that were the particular form taken by the EU sovereign debt crisis. The sovereign debt crisis in the EU is not the same thing as the financial crisis which begins in the private sector. The institutional asymmetry I want to discuss worsened the sovereign debt crisis and had some very peculiar effects and consequences we're still living with now. So my argument is that, paradoxical as it may seem, the flawed design of monetary policy and monetary policy law at EU level has contributed to it's become an obstacle to economic integration. Right, okay. Briefly, we know that in the 2000s, nearly all the debtor states, those who later became debtors, had complied with the Maastricht convergence criteria. They did not have high budget deficits prior to the crisis. Okay. Greece did, but Greece was a special case because Greece got Goldman Sachs to help it manipulate its public accounts to give a misleading impression of what was going on in Greece. But the other debtor states, the future debtor states, were not failing to comply with the convergence criteria, and they were not overspending in social policy terms. Unit labour costs, however, were growing in these states. So this is what I mean when I talk about barriers to integration. The economies were getting further apart, not closer together during the 2000s. We have a northern European core based upon a kind of German origin model and what one might call a southern European model. The northern European model is slow growth, very low levels of growth in GDP compared to high levels of growth in the future debtor states. Very high growth in unit labour costs, so inflation is running away in the southern states from the level it's pitched at in the so-called German core. Now that's partly, I think, because of a failure of institutional design, by which I mean if you put in place a single monetary policy with a central bank and a single interest rate, and you take away power from sovereign national central banks, then this single inflation rate is bound to have an impact on the economy. But its impact was asymmetrical because not all states came from the same economic background or had the same economic policy. So we see above productivity wage increases, high inflation in some states, and below inflation increases in wages. In other states, the single interest rate policy is too inflexible to deal with this, otherwise it would have been dealt with. But also, there's no single social policy. Now remember, monetary policy is unified after Maastricht. Legally, it's a federal competence, if I can call it that, and economic policy is a shared competence. It's both a state competence and an EU-level competence. Social policy is even more clearly, although it's technically shared, a matter for the states. So the states don't have a common approach to wage determination. So they're not all able to deal with this problem in the same way. Some of them are much better than others at producing below inflation wage increases. These are the northern states. And of course, because we're in a single currency area, some economists would argue, Bob Hanke, Germany is structurally forced to maintain low inflation while others inflate. So that's the effect of the hard ECB constraint. It's producing asymmetry and diverging real economies in the 2000s. This is just very briefly what I've said already. Different labour laws operating in different countries. Some systems are very good at imposing wage restraint and reducing inflation, and others are not. What did the EU do? Of course, had we had single national currencies, not a single European one, there would have been devaluation. And states which were faced with a severe recession when the shock occurred would have devalued their currency. And this would have been a fairly flexible response, and it would have avoided some of the worst effects. But you can't do that in a single currency zone, right? Because Italy or France are now like California or New York. They have no power to make their own monetary policy. And they can go bankrupt, right? Well, the United States can't. Sovereign states really can't go bankrupt, but you sure can inside the monetary union if you're a subunit of the central authority. What happened? Well, also, the power to deal with the crisis has apparently been taken away. So what a central bank would normally do in response to this situation is exactly what the Bank of England did, or the Federal Reserve did. Loosen monetary policy, right? Quantitative easing, which now, only now, is the ECB considering. So because they couldn't do QE, what happened? Apparently it was the fault of social policy. So that meant devaluing internally, cutting wages, cutting social security benefits, and raising taxes. That, of course, is deflationary and further exacerbates the effects of the crisis. So the Commission and the other members of the Troika fell upon this structural adjustment policy, I would suggest, because there was not much else they could do. They couldn't have a flexible monetary policy. It was ruled out by Article 125 and 126 of the TFEU. However, this didn't work. So at some point, the central bank had to begin behaving a bit more like a normal central bank. Very, very slowly, the central bank began to say, we will buy sovereign debt. Now, apparently, they can't. They're forbidden from buying sovereign debt by virtue of the monetary policy design in the Maastricht Treaty and what's now the TFEU. But they did it anyway. The Securities Markets Programme was first, and then the Outright Market Transactions Programme, the OMT. But that merely had to be announced. It hasn't ever really been implemented. The OMT was announced. Draghi said, we will do whatever it takes. Now, technically, they're not buying debt issued by Greece or other debtor states. They're buying it on the secondary market, but there's really not much difference. A state issues debt, a bank buys it, the ECB buys the debt from the bank. Okay. So you could very well say this is unconstitutional and questionable. However, Draghi justified this, as we all know, by saying that the monetary transmission mechanism had failed. Now, that's true. Of course, in the extreme crisis conditions in which all this was happening, it was undoubtedly correct to say that the normal monetary transmission mechanisms which are required to work for the European central banking system to work were not operating. Fair enough. So Draghi said it's an emergency situation. We're going to engage in this practice of effectively buying sovereign debt. And this, of course, did the trick. So the spread between the interest rates demanded, the yield demanded for holding Greek debt and creditor state debt basically went down as soon as Mario Draghi said this. And that spread had only emerged in the first place because the markets didn't think or were worried that Draghi wouldn't save Greece. Right. I think the markets for a long time assumed that in a single currency area, a country like Greece in that situation would have been saved. But then, of course, they began to think maybe Greece won't be saved, and that's why we saw the spread. That's why we saw such a severe recession in Greece. That was the result of a policy mistake. It wasn't a force of nature that caused the Greek depression. It was a policy decision, which then had to be reversed later, but only after quite a lot of damage had been done. Then, of course, here's law. Right, okay, so enough economics. It ends up before the court because the legality of the, not initially the OMT programme, but some other things going on around all this, their legality was challenged. So the initial challenge was to Article 1363 of the TFEU and the European Stability Mechanism Treaty. The OMT wasn't actually directly attacked here. And the idea here was that the Union had no power to adopt the ESMT because, well, in fact, the states had no right to adopt it because it was monetary policy, and the Union had exclusive competence in monetary policy. Right. So the court was faced with that problem, and also with some other problems about the so-called no bailout rule. Article 125, 126, no assistance to a state. Buying a state's debt looks like financial assistance and is apparently forbidden. Well, the court came up with an ingenious and necessary judgment, in my opinion. I know this judgment has been very harshly criticised by many of my legal colleagues for being unconstitutional. But I think it's a very important and correct judgment because, of course, if it hadn't gone that way, we would have seen probably the collapse of the euro. So this was a vital measure beyond the law. Could the lawyers explain the result using legal reasoning? Hans was talking earlier about the death of law, but here's some ingenious legal reasoning to try to explain how the bond buying programme didn't contravene Article 125, 126. I won't go into detail, it's really lawyers' law, but Carol Lennertz, who apparently drafted the judgment, found a very clever way through the maze to say this is not unlawful. And the critical point he made was that there is this fundamental distinction between monetary policy, which is a union competence, and economic policy, which is shared. He was then able to say that the ESMT was not monetary policy. Okay, monetary policy is about price stability, okay, whereas the ESM has a broader function. Well, okay. He then said, but this would not be lawful if there's any doubt about conditionality. This is very important. So he's now saying this only works legally if the bank's actions reinforce conditionality. In other words, the debtor states must devalue internally. They must cut wages, they must cut social security, they must raise taxation. This is now the legal precondition for the legality of the bank's action. So it's a very important judgment going forward, locking in, apparently, the EU to austerity forever in the debtor states. Then, fascinatingly, and maybe here's where political science comes in, because a lawyer can't really account for all this, the German Constitutional Court gets involved and decides to hear a challenge in Germany to the OMT programme before referring the matter to the ECJ, which is cheeky, because they could have referred it to the court to begin with, but they said, here's our view on the OMT. So we're going to tell you what we think, and then we'll send it to you, so you can tell us what you think, and you better agree with us. Okay. So the German court again says, even more strongly, this is not lawful, because it's an independent act of economic policy. The ECB had no power to do bond buying. But then, in a very similar way to the Court of Justice, the German Constitutional Court said it might be legal. It might just be legal if it doesn't undermine the principle of conditionality. Okay, so Germany is saying to the debtor states, more cuts, more higher taxes, employment protection rights being removed. Okay, now it's going to go back to the Court of Justice, which probably won't have the slightest difficulty in saying again, as it did in Pringle, that this is lawful. And they'll also have no difficulty in saying that conditionality must be preserved. Well, where have we got to? My argument is that the design of monetary policy has undermined the goal of economic integration. It pushed the member states apart economically. It didn't bring them together. That's important because many economists said in the 90s, you should have economic convergence first and then a single currency. But the EU reversed the process, no doubt for political reasons, maybe some very expedient. And we're now living with the consequences because a single currency in a heterogeneous economic area is going to pull systems apart, not bring them together. But worse than that, we're seeing enforced austerity, which is not just a policy choice, but apparently a matter of legal and constitutional principle. This is the six-pack and the Stability Compact and all that stuff. And it's going to lead to a race to the bottom in labour law, which is very bad news for labour law. So this is also highly problematic, because will the bank's policies really deal with the fundamental problems? No. They may plaster over some of these short-term difficulties, so the euro will survive, but they won't solve the long-term problem of diverging economies and poor institutional design. Now, Karl Polanyi did say that in a crisis, we need a central bank to act. Right? So capitalism needs law, but also capitalism needs almost extra legal institutions, like a bank, central bank, that can act flexibly to save capitalism. Capitalism isn't self-sustaining. It depends on institutions like the central bank to save capitalists, not human beings and natural resources only, but the organization of capitalistic production itself had to be sheltered from the devastating effects of a self-regulating market. This is a lesson obviously forgotten in the 1990s, and again, heterodox economists whose voices were not being heard predicted the crisis in the States. But also, Hyman Minsky argued, again, the central bank has a critical role of underpinning the financial system, but of course does exacerbate moral hazard. So the cycle begins again. The ECB can save individual commercial banks, but the risk is moral hazard, and therefore there will be another crisis. It's just a matter of when. So we have to hope it's a long time. That's the best we can say. And meanwhile, what has the court said? The court is engaged in a very opportunistic but necessary manoeuvre to save the euro. But if it insists upon inflexibility in the application of these rules, then there'll be no way out of the crisis. We could have a European New Deal, and if we ever did have a political shift, we'd be right back in the same situation as the US Supreme Court in the 1930s, of being required to accept the political reality that the Constitution has to be adjusted to reflect the real needs of capitalism, I think.